Distinguished delegates, welcome to the 2010 Couchiching Summer Conference, a watershed moment or wasted opportunity. As I think I said in the hall, but my name is Gwen Burrows, and I'm president of the Couchiching Institute on Public Affairs. A year ago, as we began to conceptualize this conference, we were in the thick of discussions about the global economic meltdown, stimulus spending, new global financial regulations to prevent a similar catastrophe in the future. We were taking a measure of the damage to people's lives and to countries' economies, and we were not yet sure when we would come out of the downturn. And we wondered, on both the left and the right in different ways, whether there were opportunities in this crisis to rethink some fundamentals. And so we at Couchiching framed the conference around the concept of whether this moment in history will be seen as a watershed moment or a wasted opportunity to rethink some of those fundamentals, to revisit our notion of the state, and to take up the opportunity afforded by the need for economic stimulus to address pressing needs facing our country and our global community. Couchiching knew at the time that it would be a risky topic. And believe me, we had a good debate about that at the board meeting last year, because by the summer of 2010, it may no longer have felt relevant. Nonetheless, we believed that firstly, we would not yet be out of the thick of things, and I think we proved to be right there. And secondly, that many issues would be facing us in the wake of the stimulus spending. We proved to be right on both counts. As closing keynote speaker Doug Saunders, and I'm getting ahead a bit, but wrote in a column in April of this year, framing the issues we will be considering this weekend rather nicely, the wake of the financial catastrophe of the past 2 years has led us into a troubling paradox. We had our skins saved by the state. To escape mass ruination, we relied on big actions by big government, and they worked. And it's no longer possible to argue, as many people did a few years ago, that government is an impediment to the good life. Now we, whoever we are all for big government. Saunders goes on to claim that we do not trust government, though. Recent elections across the Western world, which have generally delivered moderately conservative governments, have been notable for their lack of enthusiasm for any large ideas or visions. We want parties that would like to cut taxes and reduce the size of government, although we rely more than ever on that government to keep us solvent. We don't know how to square the circle. Now, many of you may disagree with this quote, and in fact, that would be in a good Couchiching tradition. We call ourselves a civil place to disagree. But I do think it frames some of the issues under consideration rather nicely. And I can promise you with confidence that the next 3 days will be stimulating, relevant, and a fun examination of a series of issues resulting from the global financial meltdown. There I am putting economics and fun in the same sentence. Who knew that that would ever happen? So I want to take a moment to I'm a philosophy grad. I want to take a moment to particularly welcome those of you who've never been to Couchiching before, to tell you a bit about what you can expect from this weekend. Couchiching was founded 79 years ago on the belief in the importance of citizen engagement. The conference is designed to open up the space for each of you to engage with one another, with our expert speakers, and with the ideas presented. Couchiching conferences are structured to bring a diversity of views to the fore. At times throughout the conference, you'll undoubtedly hear things which resonate deeply, and other things with which you completely disagree. I know my most memorable moments at Couchiching have been ones where I've been forced to rethink my own preconceived notions and to engage with ideas in new ways. I trust that this conference will do that for each of you. The Couchiching Conference is made possible through the generosity of many donors. These donations cover over half the cost of running the conference each year, allowing us to put on this great event. In addition, through our donors' contributions, we are able to support 40-odd delegates for whom the cost of the conference would be prohibitive, including many of the youth in attendance. So please join me in thanking our partners this year. As you can see, our federal government partners are Foreign Affairs and International Trade Canada, Industry Canada, and Transport Canada. Our corporate partners include CIBC, and we have our nice lanyards from CIBC this year, TD Financial Group, RBC Foundation, Base Consulting and Management, Diebold, Gowling, Lafleur Henderson, Henry of Pelham, Investment Fund Institute of Canada, Probin and Company, Syngenta, and YMCA Geneva Park. And our foundation partners are the Burton Charitable Foundation, Jackman Foundation, and the Roll C. Buck Family Foundation. We also have a number of extremely generous individual donors, the names of whom are listed in the conference package. I wanted to single out Catherine Axel Boivy and Janos Axel, who have been supporting scholarships for Couchiching delegates for many years now. This coming year is Couchiching's 80th anniversary. For coming on 80 years, people have been coming up to the lake to engage with one another, and we want to keep this critical Canadian conversation vital for the coming 80 years. So tonight I'm kicking off our 80th anniversary fundraising campaign to raise $80,000. These funds will enable the Institute to expand its reach to a broader audience, to bring a greater diversity of voices to the conference, as well as to provide a greater number of people from across Canada and beyond the opportunity to engage in thoughtful discussion on critical issues throughout the year. So we have our nice little fundraising brochure. It's in your package. You'll see information there, and I encourage you to add your list to our name of donors. Finally, before I introduce the very patient keynote speaker, I wanted to encourage those of you who are interested in getting involved in the Institute as a volunteer. There are volunteer roles on many committees, and I encourage you to discuss with our board members, those with our board members, who are designated with a ribbon on their tags. So you'll see some of us have these, well, some have many, many ribbons, as I think Doug Gibson said, a bit like we've won horse races, and others of us have few. But do go up to board members if you're interested in engaging and talk to them about the opportunity. We really want the Institute to be vital in many ways, including through volunteers. So now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Margaret MacMillan. Born in Toronto and educated at the University of Toronto and at Oxford, Dr. MacMillan was a professor of history at Ryerson University in Toronto from 1975 to 2002, including 5 years as that department's chair. In 2002, she was named provost of Trinity College and a professor of history at the University of Toronto. During that time as well, from 1995 to 2003, Dr. MacMillan was co-editor of the International Journal, published by the Canadian Institute of International Affairs. In 2007, Dr. MacMillan left Canada to become Warden of St. Antony's College at Oxford University. Author of a number of articles and books, the publication which has probably garnered her the greatest attention and praise has been a magnificent study of the diplomatic aftermath of the First World War, Paris 1919, 6 months that changed the world. And if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to do so. It's just a wonderful book. But apparently a number of you have read it. The book won a number of prizes, including in Canada, the 2003 Governor General's Literary Award. More recently, Dr. MacMillan has written Nixon in China, The Week That Changed the World, and The Uses and Abuses of History. She's also written a biography of Stephen Leacock, who of course is an Aurelia lad, so knows this area fairly well through that eye. We invited Margaret to open the conference because we wanted a bigger frame on the issues under discussion. As we struggled to understand the impact of the financial meltdown, particularly in those shocking early days, we turned, as ever, to history. Margaret has written thoughtfully about how history can help guide us and when it should not be used this way. She has focused several of her books on significant turning points in history and how the opportunities these presented were effectively taken up or not, as well as the role of multinational bodies in trying to resolve issues confronting the world. In Paris 1919, she describes the 6 months it took to negotiate peace following the First World War, an unthinkable amount of time in today's society, where within 8 months of the global meltdown, we were expecting to see signs of recovery, and where multinational bodies such as the G8 and the G20 have 2 to 3 max days to meet. So who better to get us thinking about this moment in history than Dr. Margaret MacMillan?
Thank you very much for that very kind, much too kind introduction, and thank you all for inviting me and for listening with what I hope will be patience and perhaps tolerance. I've always wanted to come to Couchiching. I never have until now, and so I'm very pleased to be here, and it's exactly like I expected. I almost went into Casino Rama by mistake, but then I recognized that perhaps it was further down the road. 3 years ago, this August, I had just moved to Oxford to take up my job there, and two things I remember from that time. First, it was the coldest and wettest July and August that England had known in recorded history, and I spent a lot of the time thinking, why did I do this? The second thing was that a company I'd never heard of called Northern Rock began to experience some trouble, and I was struck by something I thought I would never see in my lifetime, and that was a run on a bank. There were lineups outside Northern Rock's offices. There was real panic, and we now know this was one of the harbingers of the meltdown that was going to occur. And I still look back at that period that then followed and wonder, as I think we all do, how close we came to catastrophe. We have got through it, and perhaps the temptation is to forget about just how dangerous and how perilous those moments were. But I suspect as historians look more and more at those frantic weeks, as the central bankers, as statesmen, as political leaders, as financiers tried to piece together a package that would save the world from a financial catastrophe, we will probably realize that we were much closer than we thought. Has that moment and the succeeding 3 years been a watershed or a wasted opportunity? And my answer, which won't make much of a lecture, is it's both. It is, I think, a watershed. I think it has forced us to look at what we have been doing to ourselves as societies, what we have been doing internationally, what we have been doing in the financial arrangements for managing our affairs. Is it a wasted opportunity? I think too soon to tell. History, I think, is full of examples of both. Both times when there have been moments of great crisis, when we have actually made changes, when it's been forced upon us, and times when we haven't made enough changes or when we've tended to forget. I think there is a design flaw in human nature, and that is that we tend to forget very quickly. 3 years after that very, very worrying autumn of 2007, I think a lot of us have forgotten. And we're thinking we're back on an even keel, we don't really need to worry, we don't really need to make that many changes. And I think that can be very, very dangerous. Is history helpful? Well, what history does, I think, show. I don't think history will ever give particularly clear lessons, or if it gives lessons, there are far too many of them, and you can find whatever lesson you want in history. But I think what history does show is that there are times in human affairs where we have been obliged to make changes, and we can do it. And I think that is actually, on the whole, a very encouraging message. There have been times of great crisis when things that previously had seemed impossible or too expensive or simply not something we were capable collectively of doing have become possible. And you think, for example, of the scientific advances that we make in wartime. Penicillin, which was too expensive to produce in peacetime, suddenly became something we could produce in wartime. It became possible to develop the jet engine in wartime when it would have seemed much too expensive in peacetime. We undertook, in the Great Depression, massive public works, which again would have seemed unthinkable in another time, and we managed to do it. Governments managed to pay for wars, which they thought they never would be able to pay for. They found the capacity to tax in their societies much greater, to tax their own societies much greater than they had thought. If you think again back to 2007, when you think of how rapidly American and British governments in particular responded, and virtually nationalized the banking system overnight, something that would have seemed unthinkable and would have taken months, years, decades of discussion, and probably very little would have happened. I think there have also been moments of great crisis in history when we've been forced to look at the way in which we do things, and we have sometimes, not always, but we have sometimes come up with better ways of doing them. For example, and I won't go right back, the great temptation of historians is to say, let us go back and start somewhere with the Romans or possibly the Greeks, but we'll spare you that. But let me go back to 1648. Well, you're getting off lightly is all I can say. At the end of the 30 Years' War, which was a devastating and dreadful war which left huge parts of Europe, what is today Germany, for example, depopulated, which led to widespread famine, particularly ferocious wars because they were in part religious. In 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War, and I think there was a general recognition that this could not happen again, that it was simply too costly, that Europe was not capable of bearing the price. And a new principle was agreed upon in international relations, which has more or less stayed with us today, and that is that the borders of states must be respected, sovereign states must be respected. We don't always do it, and we do find reasons, often very good humanitarian reasons, why we will not respect the sovereignty of states, but I think on the whole it's been a very useful principle, and it has helped us to manage our international relations right up until the present. And I'll jump a century, you'll be relieved to hear, or half a century, the Congress of Vienna, which marked the end of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, which did bring a system of peace known as the Congress system, which brought a period of stability to Europe, which was going to last, with one or two major exceptions, right up until 1914. And I think lessons were learnt from that. Before the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, I think there'd been a sense in international relations that wars were a zero-sum game. You lost, someone else won. If you defeated your enemy, you could take something from them. After those wars, I think there was a sense that everybody lost if the wars were too dreadful, and that everyone had an interest in a stable international system. And I think that was a recognition which was borne in upon, collectively, the Europeans because of what had happened. You think of the financial institutions that have been founded in response to major crises. The Bank of England was founded partly in response to a defeat of the British by the French, and a severe government crisis when the government recognized that if they were going to try and fight the French, they were going to need money, and they had no way of actually managing their affairs, and the Bank of England was founded to do that. The Federal Reserve Bank was founded in 1913, partly in response to the crisis of 1907, to underpin and to ensure the stability of commercial banks. And so moments of great crisis, I think, can lead us to make innovations, to take steps forward that we might not otherwise take, to rethink the ways in which we're doing things. The First World War brought an attempt, not always successful, but a very noble, I think, and heroic attempt, to create a different sort of international order, to create an international order in which there were international institutions, of course, the League of Nations above all others, that would help to provide a forum and a way for nations to settle their disputes short of resorting to war, which would help to work collectively, encourage nations to work collectively to do such things as lowering trade barriers to increase the prosperity of all rather than trying to protect the prosperity of some. Now, we see that attempt at the end of the First World War as a failure because there was another war and a dreadful war in 1939. But I think we shouldn't see it entirely as a failure. The attempts made at the end of the First World War were, in fact, going to bear fruit at the end of the Second World War. We had collectively learnt something both from the attempts and from their failure about how to try and avoid wars and how to try and deal with common issues and common problems. World War II, I think, brought a very clear recognition on the part of leaders such as President Roosevelt and his successors, and British leaders such as Churchill, our own Mackenzie King and his successors, that there had to be something better than the League of Nations. There had to be international institutions. It also brought a recognition that because of the Great Depression, politics had moved to extremes, that the Great Depression had encouraged the solutions of groups like the Nazis in Germany or the Japanese militarists, and that we should take very seriously managing the world economy. And as a result, we got the international organizations which are still with us today, the World Bank, the IMF, the GATT, and then the World Trade Organization. And so I think we can learn collectively. It often takes a real catastrophe to force us to learn. What I think we also learned, certainly in the West, but not everywhere else after the Second World War, was that it was very important to build social structures which would make people feel parts of societies. The foundations of the welfare state were laid partly out of that recognition that if you want a society to function well, as it did in wartime, if you expect people to make sacrifices for the common good, then society collectively has to undertake to look after those it is protecting. And so I think what you can see through history is moments when, as I say, such changes occurred. what seems to be common to all these moments of crises and the lack or the success with which people deal collectively with them has something to do, I think, with the size and extent of the shake-up of the old order, the way in which the old order has been shaken. And Europe was shaken to its core in the 30 Years' War. It was shaken by the Napoleonic and French Revolutionary Wars. The world was shaken by the First and Second World Wars. And that's one way of ensuring. I mean, somehow it seems impossible to go back. Things have changed. You can't just go back to the old institutions, the old orders, the old ways of thinking about things. I think what also tends to bring change is when there is real pressure for change. And I think it comes from two sources. You can probably think of others, but certainly two sources. I think in democracies, of course, it has to come from the public. There has to be a general acceptance or willingness or an understanding that there should be change. But it also has to come from political elites. I think we have to always be aware of the role of leadership in this. And this, it seems to be, is one of the worrying problems in the United States today. I think there are political elites who are capable of leading, and there are, I think you have in the White House a very, very competent team, headed, of course, by President Obama. But what you have in the United States is a system which makes it difficult to lead. You have a polarized political system, and you have a set of institutions which balance powers among the different parts of the American state, which can too often, I think, lead to stasis and to the triumph of particular interest groups. So that change can come, I think a number of factors have to be there. There is also danger, of course, that after a major catastrophe, we'll all relax, we'll mop our brows, and we'll say, thank goodness, that is over, let's get back to life as normal. And that is a very, very strong and very natural human desire. If you think of previous examples in history, before the First World War, which is something I'm beginning to work on at the moment, so I could tell you in great detail about the two or three Balkan wars, but perhaps I'll save that for another time. But what was happening in Europe, I think, before the First World War was a series of crises, was a series of crises in which Europe came very close to war. It came close to war in 1908, it came close to war in 1912, it came close to war in 1913. And I think people were lulled into a false sense of security that we got through it this time, it didn't happen, we will always somehow manage to muddle through. And I think one of the reasons that the summer of 1914 led to the First World War, to the outbreak of a major European and then World War, was that people assumed that they would be able to deal with it this time, and I think they failed to recognize just how brittle the system had become and just how dangerous it was. And by the time they realized, I mean, timing's always important in history, a lot of them were on holidays, and by the time they realized, and communications were not as good then as they are now, by the time they realized it was too late. I think we have to guard against a sense of relief and a sense that we're over it, don't worry, we can always get over it. You think of Munich in 1938, which is perhaps, I think, unfairly reviled as a sellout. I think Munich was an honorable attempt to make peace. It probably was too late. The democracies were trying to make peace with those who did not want peace. But what Munich did, I think, was give us a sense, or give people at the time a sense of relief. What it really was reprieve. And that's what we have got to try, and I imagine we'll be talking about it a lot this weekend, what we've got to try and work out about what has happened since 2007. Have we had a reprieve? Have we survived? Are we still in the middle of a crisis which perhaps we don't fully recognize? We have a number of crises at the moment, collectively, as a society. We have tended to focus on the financial one because that has had the most immediate impact. It will, I think, continue to be an issue. I don't think we're out of the woods by any sense at all, and I will return to it. But one of the dangers I think we have to guard against is that because we're focusing so much on the financial crisis, we're not looking at some of the other ones that are there as well. And again, it's I think, human nature. We can only be worried about so many things at once. The trouble is we need to be worried about several things at once at the moment, and these things may be separate, but they're also related. So before I talk about some of the financial challenges facing us and some of the questions posed by the events of the last 3 years, let me just mention three other areas which I think are really of great concern to us. There's the whole social issue, and one of the things that the financial crisis helped to cast into very high relief was the growing gap between the very rich and the very poor. in most Western societies, not all, but certainly in a good many Western societies. And this, I think, is very, very worrying. It's worrying for social stability, it's worrying for social cohesion, it's worrying when you get too many people at the bottom edge of society who feel that they have no hope and their children have no hope. And there have been some, I think, very worrying polls in the United States recently where people who normally, I mean, you always think of the United States as the country where people say, look, you know, I have opportunities, my children will have opportunities, that's what we do in the United States. And I think what you're increasingly getting showing up in the polls and in the anecdotal evidence is people saying we don't have any hope. We don't have any hope for ourselves, we're just struggling to keep our heads above water and sometimes not always doing that. And we don't have hope that it's going to be better for our children. And that seems to me is a very dangerous thing for the United States because there's always been this tremendous social safety valve in the United States, political safety valve, that people always assume that things will get better and that their own personal circumstances will get better. And when you take hope away from people, I think you turn them in directions which can be very dangerous and very damaging. They can become bitter, they can become hostile to the system. And I think we see this. Again, I take the United States as an example because the disparity between rich and poor is much greater there than in a number of other Western democracies, including Canada. But the feeling that I think is fueling a lot of the Tea Party movement and some of the weirder groups who are doing training with guns in the forests of Virginia or wherever, I think what's fueling that is a sense of helplessness, powerlessness, and a feeling that no one's listening to them. Now, I think we can understand that, but it's a very dangerous thing when you get significant numbers of people in a society who feel that. And I think that is a problem. I think, of course, we're still dealing with a huge environmental threat. And we've tended to take our eye off that because other threats have seemed more immediate, but it's not going away. All the evidence, or the preponderance of evidence, I won't say all the evidence because evidence can always be challenged, but it seems to me at the moment the preponderance of evidence is that something significant is happening to our climate and that what we are doing is having a role in that. Now, these may be changes that would be happening anyway. Global warming, climate change might be happening in any case, but the factor that is different is the tremendous amount of carbon emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere. And this is something that, if we are prudential and sensible, we will have to take into account. And increasingly, I find it, what's happening with the environmental issues is either people are saying, what can I do? Which is a very, again, natural but not very helpful response, or people are saying, I don't believe in it. And I find this a curious formulation. I was at a dinner party, and someone said, I don't believe in global warming. And I said, well, it doesn't seem to me it's a matter of faith. It's not like believing in God or not believing in God. It's something to be discussed. It's an issue, but it's not something that you take a position on. You don't say, I'm a global warming believer, I'm a true believer, or I'm a global warming not believer. I mean, it just seems to me a very curious formulation, and it seems to me trying to make something that should be a matter of rational thought into a matter of simple credo. I'm not going to believe in it, don't believe in it, won't believe in it, won't listen to anything, because it's a matter of faith, and this worries me. The other thing I think, of course, that is something, an area that we need to worry about and need to look at, is the whole international scene. The world is changing, and living through periods of change is never easy. Now, some of what's changing seems very new, and we're having to try and understand what the tremendous strength of the internet means. It means greater communications. I sometimes fear that it means that every nutcase in the world can get together now with every other nutcase and form strange groups. I get emails from some of them. It's very easy now to find people, and I get my favorite emails are the ones that say you're a complete disgrace to the historical profession. I haven't read your book, but I know that you are a disgrace. I tend to get waves of these. I mean, I think the internet clearly is doing something different to our world, the electronic revolution, although I wonder if sometimes its impact is being overstated. I mean, there's a lot of stuff being written now about how our brains are changing and how the way in which we react to things are changing. It seems to me that we've always, I speak for myself, had trouble concentrating. And the idea that it's all to be blamed on BlackBerries or computers is perhaps just rather unfair. But perhaps things haven't changed as much as we would like to think in the international order. Nation states still matter. Power still matters. Now, clearly there are many kinds of power. Soft power matters. Influence matters. But in the end, power, the ability to put boots on the ground, the ability to project your will, the ability to force others to do what you want, this is still very important. And we're living in a world in which power is shifting and moving. And as I say, this makes an uncomfortable world in which to live. We don't know, and I don't think we can tell yet, precisely how that power is shifting. The European Union, it seems to me, has not turned in to the supranational power that it thought it would. What the recent financial crisis has shown, I think, is the tremendous strains in the European Union, the tremendous difficulty that the different European peoples and nations have in actually working together on common goods. I mean, the very difficulty they had in putting together the bailout for Greece. And we're not out of, again, we're not over that one yet. That seems to me to indicate the European Union has a long way to go before it becomes something more cohesive. And indeed, there are those who fear that the recent strains of the past 3 years have probably put paid to any idea of further European cohesion, and may well. I mean, there are the pessimists who say it may well mark the end of the European Union as a significant force, that it may simply remain as an economic union, but may not be capable of moving beyond that. The United States, I would argue, is in a period of decline. Now, this can be, I think, overstated. The United States has a long way to go before it's I can never say that word, before it doesn't count. The decline of Britain was a slow and gradual decline. I mean, we tend, I think, because we know the end of the story with powers such as Britain, to read back into the earlier period and believe that the decline was much more pronounced than it really was. But I think it is fair to say that the United States cannot retain the dominant position in the world that it has had since 1945. It was in some ways a fluke. It was in some ways a result of other powers being destroyed during the Second World War, and with the breakup of the big European empires and the end of the influence of those empires, a number of other powers have begun to emerge on the world scene. As the United States declines in power, I think it will be a rather perilous situation for the world. It will be difficult because there will be pressures in the United States to try and avert that decline, to try and show that the United States still is a major military power. The other problem, and it will be a problem collectively for the world, is that the United States will decide it no longer wants to bear the burden of being the world's policeman, being the world's monitor, trying to keep the whole system afloat, and that there will be rising pressure of isolationism. I mean, that's always been a strain in American thinking, and I think there are reasons why that would appear very attractive at the moment. We're also seeing, as the United States, and this could be something that lasts for decades, I mean, it's not something that's going to happen, but as the United States slips in economic terms, in military terms, in terms of political influence in the world, there will be other powers rising. And that's not always an easy transition to manage. I mean, you look at the rise of Germany after 1871, and that was a very, very difficult transition for Europe to manage, and in fact contributed to two world wars. You look at the rise to Japan of world power, not an easy transition to manage, and resulted in the war between the United States and Japan. And we have other powers in the world who are now going to be, as the balance changes, asserting themselves. China, of course. And I think there are signs that the Chinese are beginning to try and rethink their position in the world. They talk about themselves in various ways. I mean, one line of conversation, or one line of rhetoric that the Chinese use is that we've always been a peaceful people. We've never taken over territory belonging to anyone else. We've always been a Pacific power. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, all you have to do is look at a map of China and see how much it grew in the last dynasty. In 1644, when the Ming were overthrown by the Qing, China was not that big a country. By 1911, when the last dynasty disappeared in China, it was very much bigger. And there were a lot of people who were incorporated into China and put under the rule of the Han Chinese who had not previously been under that rule. You tell the Taiwanese, you tell the Tibetans that the Chinese, or you tell the people, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, that the Chinese have always been a peaceful people who've never menaced their neighbors, and they will have a very different view. So you have that one school of thought, or one type of rhetoric in China, but you also have the rhetoric which says China needs its place in the sun. And we've heard this before. It can be unsettling. People's Daily a week ago in Beijing had a headline saying, "Is the United States ready for China's ascent as a great power?" And the tone of that article was very, very critical, more openly belligerent than the People's Daily has been for some time about the United States. There will be a collision, the article said, if the United States doesn't give way. And that seems to me to indicate a new mood in China. And I think you will find in China that the government itself is going to be pushed in that direction, because what it has done and what the party has done for its own reasons and for reasons of social stability is to promote a highly nationalistic version of Chinese education and Chinese history. And that has contributed to creating a younger generation of, in some cases, highly nationalistic Chinese who are alert to any insult to China, very, very determined to protect China's interests. At the same time as we have this shift in global power, and as I say, it's not an easy time in human affairs. I mean, that is one thing history shows. As one power is coming up and another is going down, or as powers are coming up and other powers are going down, this is not easy. We have large problems, which the international system is being strained by, which it's trying to deal with. We have problems of failed states. How do we contain failed states? How do we deal with them? When failed states, such as Somalia, for example, become havens, not just for pirates, but for people who want to wreak havoc, as they have been doing throughout Africa and parts of the Middle East. How do we deal with terrorism, either state-sponsored or sub-state terror? How do we deal with cyber terrorism? This is a new brand of terrorism, but I think something of great concern. How do we deal with nuclear proliferation? We haven't really been focusing on that. And again, I think it's because as I say, we can only worry about so many things at once. But the spread of nuclear weapons, the failure to check that spread, I think is very, very alarming indeed, particularly when such weapons get into the hands of unstable regimes who may be tempted, or whose leaders may be tempted to use them as a last resort. And we have a number of serious unresolved issues which, if they were to involve nuclear weapons, could really be catastrophic, at least on a regional level. The Israel-Palestinian issue is far from being settled. If anything, it seems to be moving further from settlement. Taiwan remains a flashpoint. It has not been settled, and the Chinese have reacted recently very, very angrily to any suggestion that the United States will defend Taiwan. India-Pakistan, I think, remains something that we should all be deeply concerned about, and both those countries possess nuclear weapons, and it is a concern. I mean, we have to hope that the regimes will be stable enough that there will not be the temptation to use them. And so the problem we face, I think, collectively here and around the world is, how do we try and deal with all these issues? Should we prioritize them, or should we try and deal with them all at once? If we focus just on the financial issues, the trouble is the other issues won't wait, and we can't just assume that things can be settled in some sort of sequence. Furthermore, these very pressing issues, it seems to me, mask or tend to cast into shadow other very important questions that I think collectively we need to be asking ourselves as societies about governance. How do we run ourselves? How do we run our institutions? About democracy. Are our systems truly democratic? I mean, are there problems with them? Do we have large parts of the population who feel that they have no particular say or no interest in what is going on? I mean, I find very, very worrying in the West that the number of those voting is going down every year, and the number of young voting in most advanced democracies is really quite small. People my age tend to vote still. The young, I make exceptions to all of you here, but the young are tending not to turn out and vote, and that seems to me very worrying. How do we try and build a sense of shared goals? It seems to me one of the things that's happened in the past 30 years has been an elevation of self-interest, not to say greed, as something that should motivate people, and a sense that you must simply look after yourself, get ahead. The rise of gated communities seems to me very much a symptom of that. Not just a response to crime, but a sense of turning inwards and locking the door and keeping the less fortunate at bay. And I think we do need to be discussing how we can build shared goals as societies, how we can try and give people a sense of working together for a collective good. Well, let me say something about the financial side, and this I will not say all that much because there are people here with much greater expertise than me, and I think we will be talking a lot about this during the course of this weekend. And I think one of the questions is, have we really had a recovery yet? Or have the things that have shaken us to the core, and shaken the core? I mean, what I think is really important about this crisis, it's not just a crisis in a small country, it's not just a crisis in Zimbabwe, it's not just a crisis in Argentina, serious as those are for the people living in those countries. This is a crisis that has affected the core of the world economic system, and that core has been badly shaken. And so we have to be deeply concerned about whether we have actually got through it. I think it's becoming clear, although there will be disagreement on what the causes were, that there were severe strains on the system, and there were some who were beginning to point to these. There were some economists who were pointing to them. There were some people warning that the system and the continual pressure upwards of things like house prices was simply unsustainable. They were not listened to. They were told that they were pessimists. They were overstating it. But if you look back, there are a number of crises in the past which have very, very similar characteristics. So there's a very interesting book which I commend because I think it puts this very, very clearly by Carmen Reinhardt and Rogoff arguing. It's a book called This Time is Different. And the title comes from an anecdote at the time of the, what was the, it was a capital company, long-term capital, which failed. It was a harbinger, I think, very much of some of the problems that were going to come later on. And someone there, as they were sitting in the room trying to save this firm and trying to save Wall Street and the American economy from the consequences of the collapse of long-term capital, said, oh, but this time it's going to be different. This time is different. We understand much more. We're clever. We've got better instruments. We have computers. And what they're saying is, no, it really isn't ever that different any time. And what they've done is look at a historical sequence of crises, going back as far as they can gather data. So they go back into the 16th and 17th centuries, and they have collected a huge number, sets of data. And they say you can see the same patterns emerging again and again as we had before 2007. Huge macroeconomic imbalances, very large surpluses in exporting countries and very large deficits in developed economies, tremendous drive for investments, riskier and riskier because as the return on investment gets less, as more and more capital is looking for investments, a greater willingness to take risks, demands for new instruments, new ways of sharing the risk, new ways of making money, pressure to remove regulation, which is seen as holding back all these forces which are going to make people rich. In most previous crises, there have been an explosion in asset prices. In this case, we saw it in housing prices, for example. I mean, the tremendous increase in housing prices. Let me just give you one extraordinary figure which really struck me. Between 1996 and 2006, in 10 years, house prices in the US went up by 92%. 3 times the cumulative increase, which was 27% between 1890 and 1996. So, I mean, if you show it on a graph, it's just shooting way off the top. I tend to think that part of what led to some of the trouble we got into were not just these complicated new instruments which were being used to try and spread the risk, but I think our faith in computers. I think we have a faith that computers have this tremendously powerful capacity to crunch numbers. You can feed in all sorts of things. They can deal with huge amounts of information in a way that the human brain can't. And that if you have powerful enough computers and you have good enough data, you can actually predict risk. You can take the danger out of financial transactions. And I think it's very significant that a number of the people who became very important in what the banks were doing with people they call quants, brilliant physicists, people with extraordinary mathematical ability. And all of this, I think, was very compelling, very seductive. What it overlooked, I think, was human behavior and human nature and the capacity of human beings to behave as herds, both for good and for bad, to follow something when they think it's going up, to buy houses even if they can't afford them because everyone tells you that the house price is going to go up and up and up and never go down. Or again, when panic hits, immediately to sell, to stampede in a different direction. And I think our tremendous fascination with and reliance upon computers has helped to encourage that view that we could somehow remove what had been risks in the past. I think there was an arrogance in this too, that we were clever. We had better machines, we had better tools, we knew more. We were cleverer than people in the past. I mean, the Dutch went crazy and they bought tulip bulbs. We wouldn't do something like that. We'd just buy subprime mortgages. I think we know some of the problems. We know, I think, some of the difficulties. We also, I think, are very much aware of the consequences. The consequences have been hard for societies. The penalties for that irrational exuberance, that tremendous increase in securitization of debt, in selling all these instruments, in peddling all these instruments, in house prices, has been paid collectively by us. We have been paying the price of bailing out the institutions that got themselves into such trouble. As someone said in the Financial Times, some banks, not all perhaps not Canadian banks, but banks in Britain and the United States, have become very adept at privatizing the profits and socializing the gains, socializing the losses. And I think there is something in that. And of course, we've now got ourselves into a position of moral hazard, because if banks or similar institutions are too big to fail, will that affect the ways in which they behave? If you know you're too big to fail, if you know you'll be bailed out at some point, does that take away an incentive to behave with prudence, to behave cautiously? And I think clearly that it does. What has also, I think, been very much damaged by this recent financial crisis is, Paul Volcker put it very well, the sense of mutual trust in the system, which makes financial works, has gone, and it will be hard to reconstruct. I mean, so much of what we do depends on trusts. Our contracts, in the end, I think, depend on trust. I mean, yes, they're enforceable, but I think in the end, most of what we do in our societies is based on trust, that when we sign something, it will work, that we can trust the other person to do it. And once damaged or once destroyed, that sense of mutual trust, I think, is hard to restore. And it's had, of course, wider political consequences. It has led to the fraying of the social safety net, as governments have to cut back on what they're providing to their publics. It's led to a number of states being very close to bankruptcy. I mean, you probably all know the joke about what's the difference between Iceland and Ireland. And this was being told about a year ago. 1 letter in 6 months. Now, Ireland has actually pulled itself back from the brink, but it is going to be very, very hard on the Irish people. And I think it's significant that Ireland, which for a very brief time in its history was actually seeing an inflow of immigrants, is now beginning to lose its talented young again. They're moving out because they can't get jobs and because they see no future there. There is, I think, as I said, this threat of this unfocused anger, which is leading to things like the Tea Party. I think also what you're seeing internationally is a resentment of Western institutions and indeed of Western countries, which are seen as having caused a lot of this problem through the risky behavior of their banks. Well, what can we do about it? Are we out of the woods? And I don't think we are. I mean, I think the recovery is slow. It's sluggish. The newspaper, The Globe today, pointed out the Canadian house prices are now beginning to stagnate and possibly decline. The housing market in the United States and parts of Europe is very, very bad indeed. The latest figures from the United States show the number of personal bankruptcies went up sharply in July, and this is probably a very rational way of dealing with the burden of debt which you can no longer pay. And it is easier to go bankrupt in the United States, but it still seems to me to say something is fundamentally worrying about what is happening in the United States. Unemployment is continuing to go up. Deficits are continuing to go up, not, I think, so much because governments are bailing out banks and spending on trying to stimulate the economy, but simply because the taxes they can collect, the revenues they can collect, are going down. So are we really rethinking the system? Are we beginning to question some of those who got us into the mess? It seems to me that there is some questioning now of economists and their capacity to predict the ways in which systems will work. There's also a challenge to the conservative view that the free market will solve all. And I think we're recognizing that there is a need for regulation, there is a need for supervision. You can often tell a lot about jokes, and I will tell you my one joke, and this is a light bulb joke about economists, which I just heard. How many economists does it take to change a light bulb? An infinite number, because they all sit there in the dark and wait for the invisible hand to do it. So I think there is perhaps a healthy skepticism about those who claim that economics is a science, that it can predict everything, that all difficulties can be ironed out. There is, I think, a very important debate now about regulation and supervision, and about the need not just for new national institutions, but new international institutions. But change comes slowly, because it is difficult to make change. You look at the extraordinarily long banking bill, which has just gone through the US Senate, and I think it's a tremendous achievement. But a lot of people are saying it doesn't go far enough. There are a number of issues we still collectively haven't grappled with, and we haven't really dealt with the issue of the ratings agencies and how they were not arm's length from the organizations to which they were giving ratings. We are imposing tougher capital requirements. The Basel system, the Basel banks, in Basel they've got together and agreed that there'll be tougher capital requirements for banks, but these will be phased in gradually and I think won't be complete until 2018. A number of the trading practices that caused the problems are still going on. A number of issues about how you monitor and how you deal with the whole shadow banking system, it seems to me, really need to be dealt with. And I do think we have to worry about how much our confidence and the confidence of those around the world has been shaken in the fairness of the system and the system itself. And so, while I'm not entirely optimistic, I do think we need to take this opportunity to think about where we're going and what we're doing. And it seems to me there's some very important issues that we have to deal with. We have to deal, yes, with how to prevent a recurrence of this and how to make sure that the financial systems in countries and around the world work better. But I think we also need perhaps to reflect on our own societies, and perhaps it's a good moment to do that. Have we entirely been going down the right road in the past 30 years? Are there things we could have been doing differently? Are there questions we should have been looking at? We had a very interesting panel at my college in Oxford with a number of economists, Adair Turner, who was head of the Financial Services Authority in England, and Paul Collier, who's a development economist, and Robert Skidelsky, who's the great biographer of Keynes. And Adair Turner gave the lecture, and then Skidelsky and Collier commented on it. And what was very interesting is they all started out on highly technical grounds, and they all ended up dealing with moral issues. They ended up by saying, what should we be doing? What should we be discussing? What sort of society do we want? And these are questions that go well beyond how do we manage the regulatory aspects? How do we manage the supervisory aspects? Should banks be both retail and investment? I mean, these are really, I think, very interesting and fundamental questions. What should we be asking? I think we should be asking whether our institutions are strong enough, whether they're effective enough, can they deal with challenges which I think they're going to have to deal with. I mean, I think the idea that we are home free is very, very wrong indeed. Again, if the Reinhardt and Rogoff book, This Time is Different, calls this particular period the second great contraction. And the first one for them was the Great Depression. And they say the signs are very, very similar. It's much bigger, and they think it's going to last much longer than the contractions of the 1970s, for example, or the contractions of the 1990s, which means we're going to have to deal with a high level of unemployment. We're going to have to deal with tremendous strains on public finances, not just for the next while, but for a considerable length of time, if they're right. And I must say I found their arguments very compelling. Do we have the right leaders? And this is not something we can always will summon up at will, but I do think it's very important to have good leadership at this point. And I think in a number of countries we have simply not seen the sort of leadership that we want. I think Angela Merkel in Germany has not really provided the sort of leadership that the most powerful economy in Europe should be providing for the situation in Europe. Well, I'll leave aside Berlusconi, who provides interest but not much else. I think Gordon Brown was in some ways a good leader, but he had a capacity. He lacked the capacity to bring people to work together, and I think that was a problem. The new coalition in the UK may work. Do we have the right leaders? Is there a public will to make changes? Are we prepared to do things which may be difficult and may be expensive? Are we prepared to pay that price? What values and ideas and practices should we be re-examining? Should we look skeptically at the idea of rational economic man and woman? Do we all ourselves in our own lives make decisions on the basis of rationality? And I would say we do not. And I think we need to look at some of the fundamental assumptions in economics, as some economists are doing. A number of economists are now beginning to look much more seriously at psychology, for example, as a way of trying to understand human behavior. I think we also need to look at questions like, what is society for? And I think these are moral and ethical questions. What should we be trying to do in our societies? What constitutes happiness and the well-lived life? I mean, we've tended to forget about that in the past 30 years. We've tended to focus on consumption, we've tended to focus on growth, we've tended to focus on satisfying our material needs. And I think there are other questions and other issues and other needs that we have perhaps not really been taking all that seriously. Is consumption and is massive choice, endless choice, what makes us happy? I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Hurt Locker, which I thought was a very fine movie indeed, but there's a moment in that when the bomb disposal expert is back from a tour of duty and his wife asks him to buy some cereal, and he stands in this giant supermarket looking down these shelves of cereal, and he doesn't know what to do. He has so much choice, he's simply incapable of making a decision. Another very, very interesting book, and others are saying this, but is this book which I've just been reading called The Spirit Level, which looks at societies in which people declare themselves to be more content and more happy. And such societies tend to, if you see them on an axis, they tend to be ones in which the gap between the rich and the poor is less. Scandinavian countries, Canada, and the societies in which are completely off the charts, the UK in recent years and the United States, there is a greater level of unhappiness. Now, measuring happiness is very difficult, as we know, but I think these are questions that we need to ask. Well, will we be asking them? My optimistic answer is yes, that this crisis will have forced upon us fundamental rethinking, that we will be asking such questions, and we will be going beyond just asking the questions of how do we make sure that the financial system doesn't melt down again, and how do we try and get out of this particular situation that we're in, and that we might go beyond that and ask some more fundamental questions. How do we deal with what are a very wide range of problems, and how do we examine our own societies? How do we ask about what makes a good society? I mean, these are questions for philosophers, but I think very, very important questions, and we should all be dealing with them. Let's hope we do that. The other possibility is we'll simply ignore the issue, that we'll be so relieved that we got through this one, like people were in 1913 in Europe, or people were in 1938 in Europe, that we will ignore it, or we'll deny it. The human capacity to face awkward things is considerable, but the human capacity to deny things it doesn't want to deal with is also enormous. I mean, I think we see this with the denialism over climate change, and people simply refusing to recognize it. I won't believe in it. It'll go away if I say I don't believe in it. I suspect we'll probably end up somewhere in the middle. We'll probably do both rather badly. We'll grapple with the issues, or we'll try and ignore them, and we'll go on that way until the next crisis comes. Thank you.